Hello, teacher candidates. Hi, this is Dr. Rick Barsh. Once again, I believe this is our third podcast of Step One. And so Step One obviously is one of the longest components of this, obviously because of the planning that's entailed. By now, you should come to a place where you've planned effectively about this. This is all part of, again, the plan, teach, assess, reflect, and apply cycle. And by now, I would imagine that you're into clinical practice, you're teaching at least a period or half the day. Perhaps some of you are already teaching the full day. And so by now you should be having conversations with your master teacher about what lesson that you could create, this TPA around, what unit that might be involved in. And so be having those conversations, because by now you really should be kind of thinking about what that lesson is going to be. Maybe you've even mapped it, maybe practice it, which I highly recommend before you go right before the camera, where you've actually kind of articulated these things almost like you would a speech in front of a mirror. So that would be my recommendation, is that you've gone through some of that vocal articulation so that it seems a little bit more fluid, and you're anticipating those transitions, even what students might respond with. So hopefully you were able to go to the workshop. If not, there should be an email out very soon getting you the link to that recording of the TPA workshop that was held last weekend. And I hope you're able to attend. I know there's a little bit of difficulty for our virtual folks watching online, but you should be able to see that first segment that you missed. So on behalf of Dr. Backrack and I, again, let us know how we can serve you. And we've created this here for you. So let's get to it. This is the last podcast for Step One. By now, you've maybe written the lesson plan template, and now you're ready to talk about the rationale. This is perhaps the most important part of any of the TPA's process, and that is the reasons why you're doing what you're doing. So there's the what, but now there's the why. And so in this particular point, you look at the directions here. This can be up to 5 pages. This is kind of the step before you're ready to go ahead and record, which I would recommend, again, that you've tested the equipment before you do that. But you can see here that what we're going to ask you to do is to go ahead and, if you look at Step One, is to explain how the lesson plan builds on students' prior academic knowledge. That is, kind of how they are able to relate this new content to previous learning. This could be things that they've been interested in, but certainly things that they've learned about that's related to the content. The second prompt there, as you look at the TPA Step One, is considering students' assets and needs. Sometimes we call these funds of knowledge when you think about assets. This could be students' cultural background and various linguistic resources. But this is about their prior experiences relating to not just their culture, but just, life experiences. These would be things that you would only know as you get to know your students, whether those are conversations you have with them, or maybe, again, like I mentioned last podcast, maybe a worksheet that you give to them that they can fill out and you can maybe meet with them and discuss. This is certainly helpful for your focus students because you want to get to know them even more in depth. But again, this has to do with everything they're interested in, maybe extracurricular activities, what their family life is like. So again, those are students' assets and needs. Needs can also be represented in students' IEPs or 504 plans. But for many of our students who don't have those, that can certainly be noted by the master teacher. If you want to talk to them, this would be something that would probably be able to give you more background on what those needs might be, especially from an academic perspective. Step 3 there, or prompt 3, is about students' learning activities. I'm going to read that to you. It says, explain why you selected the learning activities and how you engage all students in higher order thinking. This is what the assessor is looking for. They're looking for how you're kind of mapping and sequencing, moving students up Bloom's taxonomy of thinking. So we call these HOTS, or higher order thinking skills. And so you really want to be thinking about, how am I engaging students and moving them up, even within the lesson, towards higher order thinking, like analyzing or synthesizing or predicting or evaluating. And so how do your learning activities mirror that? What is it about your learning activities? Why did you choose those activities? Again, they're looking for the why. As we move on here, number 4, explain why you will use specific instructional strategies. So whether it's the use of cooperative learning techniques, whether it's the use of some kind of project-based learning, whether it's even the use of some kind of Socratic seminar. Obviously, at the younger ages, you might be using other types or modifying some of those strategies, but certainly cooperative learning is one that a lot of us would be using. But again, how will you use those strategies and what adaptations might you make to improve student access to learning? Okay, so when we think about multiple means of representation, that is, what is it that the teacher's doing, right? We think about UDL, that is, what are you doing to engage those students? Modeling, scaffolding, asking questions, those kinds of things. The next one deals with student grouping. So I would just remind you that when you think about student grouping, once again, you're going to give your rationale for why you grouped students the way you did. Why do they sit in the classroom the way they do? When you perform an activity, why have you grouped them in the ways that you have? Academic language development. This one speaks to how you will address the academic language needs of the students. So how are you maybe front-loading vocabulary? Or how are you scaffolding and sequencing some of the academic tasks? Where have you embedded listening and speaking? Remember, these are key domains that our ELL students must have, and hopefully you're presenting before them. And really, it's best practice for all students. So once again, what are you doing to create opportunities for students to both listen and speak using vocabulary? Number 7, explain why you chose particular resources and materials. That's kind of self-explanatory. In other words, why did you choose the difficulty of the text at the level that you did? Why are students given certain resources? Maybe it has to do with things that are set up by the district in terms of programs, but also why did you select that choice if we're thinking about what's best for kids? And looking at your assessments, I would just remind you that when we think about assessments, it's not always in the formal sense. It could be in the informal sense, self-assessments, check-ins for understanding. But again, what did you do to check for understanding throughout the lesson, okay, informally and formally, and why did you choose those particular assessments? How are they linked intimately to the objectives? And again, folks, I strongly recommend here especially is for you to base all decision going back to the objectives that you chose for students, which of course are linked then back to the standards. So always think in having these conversations of rationale, what are my standards? How are they linked to the objectives? And how are the objectives, of course, linked to my activities? And in this case, assessments I chose. Assessors will want to see this. And lastly, what about the developmental considerations? When you think about your social and emotional culture of your classroom, and certainly the age level of your students, maybe even for some students who have typical and atypical behavior development, how does your lesson address those developmental considerations of your students? How is it age appropriate, but also student appropriate when you think about those particular student needs? And finally, there's the focus students, this is huge, right? Because now we're leaning into what we've learned about students, these 3 focus students, your student with special needs, your ELL student, and students who come from an underserved population. And so what they want to know here is, what are you doing to make sure that you're creating inclusive learning opportunities for these students? This could relate itself to the ways that you engage them, the assessments that you chose, the activities that you chose. But what they're looking for here is for you to clearly think about the adaptations you created and how they're intimately linked to the student's needs, okay? So that you're not just applying some kind of Band-Aid approach as to, I'm just going to give them a graphic organizer, or they're going to sit next to a student who speaks their language, or, I'm going to give them a KWL. And those are all great ideas, but how are they intimately linked to the needs of the student? So if there's anything I would urge you to do, ladies and gentlemen, throughout the TPA, and I can't overstate this, is how is what you're doing right now, the rationale, how is what you're doing right now, that activity or that assessment, or those adaptations you provided for the focus students, intimately linked to the needs and interest in the persons of the student, okay? Which of course are related to the goals or objectives, which are then of course always linked back to standards. So they want to see this conversation happen throughout the TPA, not a one and done approach. So it might seem like you're reiterating yourself over and over again, but in reality, they provided multiple opportunities throughout the TPA for you to keep speaking back to this. Again, it's plan, teach, assess, reflect, and apply. So I hope this podcast has been helpful to you. Again, you can reach out to myself or Dr. Backrack, and we'd be glad to assist you. So all the best. God bless you. Thank you.